What are my goals? Don't get injured. Don't get injured.
Don't get injured.
Well, it's not even 2021 yet, and I managed to already goof on one of my goals because this past weekend I managed to get injured. So you might have seen in a previous episode that I did show of hands, and it turns out that earlier this year, Drew Ruana put up a low start to it. The low only adds one hold more, but it's a lot of tricky moves to actually get into the start of the V10. You do this big spanny move. For me, I'm sort of tip to tip. You cross over your hand, you end up flipping your right hand and holding a lot of tension before you deliberately have to cut feet in order to get into the actual start of the V10. So during one of these attempts, when I got set up to do the foot cut move, I felt some pain in my right hand. And you can tell that from this clip, if you look at my rheumatoid arthritis looking fingers here, that when you do the cut, at least for me, I'm mostly on my middle and ring finger, and so there's a ton of weight going through my right hand. So as I cut feet, I felt sort of a sensation, not a pop or any sort of like movement, but there was some pain. And after about 15-minute rest, I noticed I can still crimp or open hand when I have all four fingers, but if I just isolate the middle finger, I have some pain. And it's not really in the finger so much as it is in the palm and the forearm. So in my non-expert advice, I figured it might be a flexor strain. And I guess since I've been injured so much in the past, I sort of have a network of friends or people I can reach out to. So as soon as I found out or figured that this wasn't something that was going away in 15 minutes, I reached out to both Dr. Natasha Barnes and Dr. Tyler Nelson to let them know about the injury. It turns out that Dr. Nelson had some time this week to talk, so I reached out to him to talk more about what happened. And after describing what happened to Dr. Nelson, who, by the way, is very familiar with the climb, it turns out what I have is likely a lumbrical muscle strain in my hand, though nothing would be definitive unless I got imaging. So with that said, Dr. Nelson will be working on a rehab program that works for me. And he seems pretty optimistic, as do I, and I'm hoping that I'm only off the rock for about a week and can spend the next couple weeks working towards getting back to projecting. So not as devastating as a pulley injury or some of the wrist injuries I've had in the past, but just a slight setback, hopefully. And I'm going to use this time to obviously rehab the injury and do a little bit of self-reflection and see if I can leverage this time as best I can. So I'll walk you through some of what my physical rehab protocol will be, but I'm hoping I can share with you something that I've learned through a few injuries, including a number of pulley injuries, 2 wrist injuries, a shoulder injury, and now this. Something that's really gotten me through the process, which is, I guess I'll call it the mental rehab portion of it. Look, if you're like me, climbing's really, really important to you. And if you're injured, I don't think that going to YouTube is the best way to find out how to physically recover from your injury. It's worth going to professionals like Dr. Barnes or Dr. Nelson, who 1, are climbers, and 2, are very passionately dedicated to growing as professionals in their field, and are always interested in how to best maximize the recovery process for athletes. And having worked with Dr. Nelson and Dr. Barnes in the past, they're just able to share information or prescribe rehab protocols that, looking at YouTube or browsing the internet isn't really going to be tailored to your specific needs. I was able to describe to Dr. Nelson where I hurt my finger, how I hurt it, and after sort of figuring out what sort of triggers the pain, he's able to give to me a very, very personalized rehab program. If you're in the same boat as I am, would definitely encourage you reaching out to a professional. But what I think I could add value to a rehab process is mentally recovering and taking you through some of the steps I take in this sort of situation. So I'll say there are 3 main points I take into consideration when recovering mentally from an injury. And the first one is going to be about reflection. And that's something I learned from Dr. Barnes and Dr. Nelson, because whenever I go to them with an injury, the first thing they ask is, what happened in the weeks leading up to the injury? And in this particular case, for the last 3 or 4 weeks, I've been trying really hard. I did show of hands and started trying the low. I've been trying meat bag. I've done some other hard climbs in Mo's in Vegas, and I think it was all just catching up to me. And in previous injuries, it was important for me to do that too. So in the case where I had a wrist injury, I had actually come off of a week forced just break from climbing because I was climbing on the moon board 3 days a week. And I also had a work trip back to back. So I had 2 weeks off of really no climbing, and then just sort of wanted to hit the ground running and climb hard again. And then I didn't realize that those 2 weeks off sort of put me in a really precarious position to be injured. So I found it really important to reflect on sort of what is the post-mortem leading up to the injury. In this particular case is I'm psyched, I'm trying hard. I was trying really hard on that move because I linked everything together, and it just, it didn't really work out for me because I've been going hard for weeks. So what I'm taking away from this is after 4 to 6 weeks of trying hard on real rock, I need to sort of weave in a forced rest and maybe just do some blood flow restriction or work on antagonist muscles or lower extremity or other things I can be doing to stay in shape, but not put myself in a situation to get injured again. So that's what I do to reflect on the past leading up to the injury. Now looking into the future and using that point of reflection is what could I do to prevent this from happening again? So going forward, I'm going to make sure I do a pretty decent warm-up, but maybe pay attention a little bit more to warming up the fingers, especially the flexors, and just listening to my body and being okay not jumping on the rock, even if I've got my friend there, we're both psyched on the climb. I have to be okay just saying, you know what, today's not the day. So if the first one is about reflection, the second point is going to be about what's still possible. So for me, it's a hand injury. I'm actually pretty lucky that I can still load the hand in half crimp, open, and full crimp. It's just when I isolate the middle finger, do I get some pain. So whether it's this particular injury, a pulley injury, shoulder, leg, ankle, what have you, there's always something you can be working on. So in my case, I probably am not going to do a very intense fingerboard workout, but I know I could be working on my core. A lot of the climbs I want to get on are roofs, and having climbed on Justin Moonboard for most of this year, I'm really good at 40 degrees, but I'm not really good at roofs. So it might be good for me to work on core, some front levers, that sort of thing. And I'm also missing just a lot of power. So this might be a good time to work on my lock-offs or work on some explosive strength and just pull on the pull-up bar, maybe do weighted pull-ups and see what else Dr. Nelson could offer in terms of keeping my body strong and healthy, and not aggravate my hand too much. Point 1 is about reflection. Point 2 is about what's still possible. And then 3 is about just staying positive. The one thing I've learned through some really devastating injuries, mainly my wrists, in both cases, I had a wrist injury in 2017. I think that I was out for about 6 months, and another one at the beginning of the quarantine in my left wrist, where I was out for about 3 or 4 months. The biggest thing I've learned is that the recovery process sort of ebbs and flows. While I think most people think at the start of an injury, over the timeline of the injury, the pain should be less, or you should feel like you're recovering almost in a straight line. But what I noticed through my wrist injuries is some days I'd feel like, oh my God, I'm weeks out from being able to climb again. And then literally the next day, even though I didn't even use my wrist or anything like that, it would feel just as bad as it did on day one. And this is something that Dr. Barnes and Dr. Nelson have lectured to me in the past, is just getting used to the fact that recovery is non-linear. And by the way, through pulley injuries and 2 devastating wrist injuries, I always came back stronger. It wasn't like the first injury I ever had was the strongest I ever was leading up to it, and now I'm just weak. I've progressively gotten stronger, especially the previous wrist injury. I felt like I was at my strongest. So I know it's hard to think about in the moment, but if you are injured, try to stay positive and remember that in most cases you come back stronger. It's going to take a little bit to get back to it, depending on how long your injury lasts or how seriously you can climb during or after an injury. But in my experience, you always come back stronger, and you have to keep that in mind. So those would be my 3 main points for mentally recovering from an injury. Number 1 is to reflect. Think about what led up to that injury and what you're going to do in the future to prevent it. 2, consider what's possible to make sure you stay healthy and strong. And 3, above all, stay positive, because not all injuries last forever in most cases, and you always come back stronger.